Hey everybody, it's Mike. Welcome to Chip Damage. And if you couldn't tell by the title of the video, we are talking about a very hotly debated topic, a topic that is controversial and has been argued about for years and years. We are talking about which was the best of the 5th generation consoles, the console war between the beloved Nintendo 64 and the legendary PlayStation 1. Now, if you're wondering why I'm bringing up this topic today, it's because Nintendo recently released Nintendo 64 games playably on their Nintendo Switch Online service, and there are a lot of rumors swimming around that Sony will release some classic PlayStation games to their online services on the PS4 and 5. And with that, of course, I'm hearing a lot of talk about what your favorite people's titles were on the N64, what people's favorite titles were on the PlayStation 1, what they'd like to see released on those titles. And of course, to some people, you always hear it come down to, oh, well, this one was better, this one was better. And it's a topic that has been raging for years and years. And in some circles, I'd say even more so than the classic console war between like the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. I see a lot of fire being spit about N64 versus PS1. And I thought I had a unique perspective on this because I was a very lonely Sega Saturn boy. Yes, I was one of the few kids in North America who decided not to go with either of the big boys. I went with the Sega Saturn because I wanted to play Sonic games, you know, the new Sonic game that never came out on the Saturn. Regardless, I was happy with my choice, but I was very lucky to have friends who bought both the N64 and the PlayStation 1 as a youngin. I had access to both of these and played them a lot. It was kind of, all right, today we're going to the N64 kids' house, we'll play there. We'll go to the PlayStation kids' house today, play that. And very rarely did kids want to come over and play Sega Saturn with me, but that's neither here nor there. But I kind of felt like I had something of an outsider's unique perspective on this. And going off of that, as I've gotten older and became a collector, I collect for both of these consoles, and I love them dearly. But I think many collectors will agree that when you do have so many titles readily available and ready to play as collectors do, and you are not kind of restricted by genre, like I like many genres on both of these consoles, you get another unique take on it. So I thought I'd bring my perspective up on this argument. And let's be clear right off the bat. There is no true answer to this. This is a completely subjective topic. The best console between these two, really, that's up to you. You already know it in your heart of hearts, and I'm not going to change your mind. No one's going to change your mind. It boiled down to, hey, which type of games did you like more, and what did you have more access to? You know, that kind of is the answer. That shapes your perspective, that shapes your opinion, and I'm not here to try to change that. But there are some objective truths when it comes down to consoles. And I'm talking about numbers. I'm talking about consoles sold, and I'm talking about games released. And I decided to do some digging on that. And I found a lot of really interesting information that added more to this argument, added more to my perspective, some things that I didn't even know. So how I'm going to structure this video, we're going to go over some hard sales numbers. We're going to talk about titles after that, titles released, some of the biggest and best titles. Now, I can't name them all. There's so many, but I can name a lot of them, and we can kind of compare and contrast what both consoles were offering, who they were for, and then I'm going to add my own unique spin on it, my own perspective, my own opinion on it. And like I said, let's not get salty about this. I want this to be a discussion as I do all my videos. I want to know in the comments below, which one of these consoles do you enjoy more? Did you have it when these first released way back in 94 for the PS1 and 96 for the N64? Did you come to them later? Do you like either of these consoles? What's your weigh in on this? And I'll try to respond to you as quickly as I can, because that is honestly my favorite part of this channel, is the discussion between gamers of different ages, different locations, and all that. So if you like what you're about to see, please subscribe. So let's get started. Now, just to begin, I'm going to throw this out there. I'm getting old. I am 32 years old. I was born in 1989. So these consoles kind of dominated my middle to late childhood. So I was the target demographic for a lot of these games, but I'm firmly aware of the marketing campaigns of both of these when they were out at the time, and they were really appealing to different audiences. And I think that's going to be very obvious. But I'm also an American. I live in North America. I live in the United States. And here in the US, and this may be a surprise to a lot of people watching this overseas, if you were to just ask anybody, you would say that these consoles were kind of neck and neck in sales. That's what I thought for many years, in number of consoles sold. And that's just not the case. I was doing some research on this because I love numbers, I love statistics, and only here in North America was the N64 a big success. So our first statistic we're going to talk about, units sold. Well, worldwide, the Nintendo 64 sold a reasonable 33 million units. Sounds like a good number. When you look at the PlayStation 1's total sales, 102 million worldwide. Insane, yes. N64 had 33 million. PS1 had 102 million, nearly over a 3-to-1 blowout by the PlayStation 1. But like I said, in the United States, you would never guess that. The N64 is so beloved here in the US. You would assume that that was a lot closer, that the N64 perhaps even passed up the PlayStation. Not the case. So I was so intrigued by this, I had to dig a little deeper. And things started to make a little bit more sense. So I broke it down by region. And of course, these statistics are pulled from the internet. I kind of averaged out some different sources. A lot of the sources that I found seem to be pretty close. I tried to balance it out between a bunch of different sources that are hard to kind of balance, like Nintendo earnings reports I looked, of course, at Wikipedia and VG charts. None of these are truly reliable, but they all kind of agreed on some basic statistics. So I just kind of averaged them. And there has to be a modicum of truth or accuracy to some of these. But let's break it down by region. In North America, the PlayStation 1 sold 40 million to the N64's 20 million. Still 2-to-1, but those are still some pretty good numbers for back in the day. 1-to-2. 20 million N64s in the US is pretty good, considering that the N64 never cracked anything close to that internationally in other countries. In Japan, the N64 sold 5 million compared to the PlayStation's 18 million, more than triple the amount of N64 sold, 18.8 million in fact. That is such a blowout. In doing my research, I saw that the Sega Saturn was more popular than the N64 in Japan, this console's home country. That is just shocking to me, how low the N64 sold there. But as we go through titles, I will tell you right now, it's pretty obvious why that was. The number of JRPG titles and fighting games on the PS1 probably appealed more to the Japanese market. But that was my first shocking piece of evidence to see why there was such a sales discrepancy worldwide between these two consoles. But then there was an even bigger one. Now, European sales, the continent of Europe. This was a little harder to kind of nail and add up, but the general consensus is that in the N64 in the European market sold 4.5 million units. That's not a lot considering how many countries are spread out over Europe. But the PlayStation 1 sold 40.12 million units on that continent. That is nearly 10 times the amount of N64s. And I've seen that in some of my comments speaking about N64 Nintendo games. So, it always seemed to be that Europeans, especially Nordic countries, I've seen in some of the comics, they don't even know what an N64 is. Like, you can go, or they've never actually seen one. They know what it is, but it's not something that you would commonly see in, retro game stores or hobby shops. But the PS1 is everywhere. It was like iconic and kind of the face of video games. I couldn't believe that. Like I said, if you're international, this may be shocking to you. But in the US, yeah, can you believe that? Like the beloved N64, I wouldn't say it was a flop, but it just didn't sell outside our home nation. Us Americans, I know it's a big country, but consider us an island. A lot of us, the other countries, especially in the 90s before internet access was common, we didn't know what was going on. We don't pay attention. That is a flaw of our culture. But that led me to some other interesting numbers. Just as an idea, the N64 sold, like I said, 33 million units roughly. That was actually somewhat of a failure for Nintendo. The Super Nintendo had sold 49 million units. Yet again, that's a pretty big drop off. The Super Nintendo, very beloved system, but in the court of popular opinion, at least here in the US, I would say that people would say that the N64 was a comparable success. It wasn't. The N64 was actually beat out by the Genesis, which, to the best of my ability to hunt down numbers, sold 35 million units. So the idea that these consoles were neck and neck is purely North American conception. And even here, it was 2-to-1. Now, why is that? Well, it comes down to the games. I would have to say, after looking through the title of the list of games we're about to go through, the fact of the matter is, I think that a lot of N64 games were multiplayer, 4 controller slots composed of the PS1s too. So you only needed one kid in a group of friends to have an N64 to satiate 4 people. Like, okay, this console's, like, my friend has it. He has all the multiplayer games. He has Smash and Mario Kart and Mario Party. We'll go over there and play them. But, like, most of the PlayStation 1 games were single player. I mean, there are a lot of fighting games 2-player, but I think that had something to do with it, that N64 was more of a multiplayer focused system. the fact that perhaps the N64 had just a strong library of first-party games targeted at a very specific audience, while the PS1 was kind of all over the place. I'm not sure, but we'll talk more about the end. Let's get into the meat of this. Let's talk about the games. That's what we're here for, not the hardware. We're here about the software, really, right? So, as you'll see, I have some of my favorite N64 games lined up next to me and PS1 games. I have the Turok 1 and 2 games on my left side, my favorite first-person shooters on the N64. I know that's going to piss a lot of people off, but I just love the crazy weapons and the vast enemy kind of variety. GoldenEye and Perfect Dark are fantastic, but they don't have the wacky guns and enemy variety of like dinosaurs and monsters and aliens that Turok did. So I played this game religiously. And then on my right, we have some of my favorite PS1 games of all time. We have Silent Hill, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear Solid. So let's talk about those right off the bat. I would say the top two Nintendo 64 games were Mario 64 and Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. I think that's pretty hard to debate, that when you think N64 for a majority of people, and of course there's always outliers and your opinion may differ, I think those are the two titles most associated with the console. They've gotten the most love over the years. Re-releases, downloadable re-releases, touch-ups on other consoles, re-releases on like 3DS and Switch and whatnot. I think those are the top dogs on the N64. PlayStation, it's a little harder. Sony didn't exactly have the best first-party lineup on their own consoles. They were more famous for their other their exclusives made by third-party companies. But I think, and this is going to be somewhat more contentious because of the sheer number of titles, but I think the top two games that you have to talk about in comparison to the top two N64 games would have to be Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII. That's what I'm going to go with right now. Now, I know I'm going to hear Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Gran Turismo, or Tekken. Those are all fantastic titles, and you could swap those out. But I think for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to put Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid on there to compare with Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time. Now, there is some objective truths to these, and then the rest is all opinion. So I can just say that right now, the top-selling N64 game, from the data I could find, was Mario 64 at 11.9 million units on home hardware. You know, all these games have been re-released and have sold more copies, but the best I could find that they sold on their home hardware for Mario 64 was 11.9, compared to, believe it or not, Gran Turismo at 10.9 million units. But Final Fantasy VII was right behind that with 10 million units sold. So, barring Gran Turismo, Mario 64 sold a bit more than Final Fantasy VII, but these are both huge titles that sold a lot of copies. For PlayStation, that's a 10% install base, and for N64, that's a 33% install base. That's a lot. Like if 33% of the people who own your console buy one game, that's a massive success no matter what. But let's compare these titles, all right? So Mario 64, the launch title for the Nintendo 64, kind of doing 3D platformers right for the first time. Now, there had been 3D platformers before that. Of course, the legendary Crash Bandicoot had premiered a bit before on the PS1, and that was a great game, very beloved and multiply re-released throughout the years. But Mario 64 was a bit bigger in scale. The controller was nearly designed for it. The game was designed for that controller with that big clunky controller that people either love or hate. That game just captured a tightness of control, a level of speed and accuracy that was kind of unseen before 1996. Legendary game. Some people say it's still the best 3D Mario. I don't agree with that. I think it's Galaxy, but I still think Mario 64 holds up as a very fun game, very charming. And as we go further in these videos, I will say that I try not to look at these games through rose-tinted glasses. I know that both of these consoles, visuals and sound, have, obviously they're not as impressive as they once were, but you have to think back at the time that they were. And I still find polygonal graphics very charming. So whether you think they hold up or not is completely subjective, as most of this video is. But I will not try to mention visuals too much, because that's just, that's impossible to that's a hump to cross. That's too hard to kind of solidify. But Mario 64, I think, still looks and plays great. And then, you have the other game on the N64, the one that maybe is just as revered on the N64, and that is Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Released in 1998, a massive game by any standard that just had like a lot of whimsy to it. is kind of the definitive version of Zelda in many people of a certain age as mine. Even now, people go back and love that game. Re-released on 3DS, still a great version. It's the Zelda game in many ways. Until Breath of the Wild came out, I think not too. I'm a Wind Waker fan. Don't get me wrong. That's my favorite Zelda game. But I think the general consensus that was out of the best 3D Zeldas, it was Ocarina of Time. And you hear that it's, along with these other games on these 4 games, one of the best games of all time. I think it's the highest rated on some websites, like aggregates like Metacritic. And those are 2 very incredible titles. Let's compare them to the PlayStation 1 titles. We have my boy Cloud Strife in Final Fantasy VII, which was a game, I'm one of those, that I was turned on to JRPGs by that game. I think most Westerners were. Before that was even a term. Final Fantasy, while pretty popular on the NES and SNES in the United States, was not nearly as popular as FF7. That game's marketing was everywhere. It had a unique kind of anime aesthetic that was popping at that time in the late 90s, just like a like cyberpunk with magic look. The game, I still think Final Fantasy VII may have the greatest soundtrack of all time. It may not be your favorite Final Fantasy, or you may not like the game, but you can't deny that that game's sound was amazing. That was an advantage that the PlayStation had over the N64, is that the amount of sound that can be stored on a CD as opposed to a cartridge was very different. It was a lot more, and it was of a higher quality. So when I think of FF7, I think the music right away. That game, also on a lot of top games of all time list, that game has been re-released on everything, not just PlayStation consoles, but like you can download it on an Xbox Series X right now if you wanted. It has, of course, famously been remade. At the time of this recording, Part 1 is out. I love that remake. I think it does justice to the game. That is very controversial on its own, but you cannot deny the impact of Final Fantasy VII. Cloud became a PlayStation icon without being owned by Sony. The remake was PlayStation 4 exclusive for almost 2 years, for a year and a half before being released onto PC. And I think he is synonymous with the genre. I think when many people of a certain age think JRPG or Final Fantasy, you think Cloud. Worldwide hit, and whether or not it's your favorite, you must admit that it is iconic. I mean, you got 2 characters in Smash Brothers there, right? Cloud and Sephiroth. And then you're moving along to Metal Gear Solid, released in 1998. Man, 97 and 98, those were damn good years for gaming. Metal Gear Solid is unique amongst gaming. Now, some people consider it that it's just a playable movie. There's too many cutscenes. That Kojima, there's too many idiosyncrasies there that it's weird. Well, you know what? I love those, and I think a lot of people did too, because that game sold very well and reviewed very well back in the time, and it's one of the most beloved franchises of all time. Originally starting on Nintendo NES of all things, but when it went 3D, it was a huge title on the PlayStation 1. And I'm from an era, and I still believe this if it's true when it's done right, cutscenes and dialogue in games were so special back in that time because you just didn't get it before that. And it was a fantastic reward. Like, you played through certain parts of games to get fantastic CG cutscenes or voice acting, and it was like a treat. You get to take a break and enjoy the story. And I think Hideo Kojima did that. Metal Gear Solid is probably my favorite franchise of all time, and it's right up there with Final Fantasy and Sonic and Donkey Kong, and but Metal Gear Solid brings more joy to me. And I'm someone who came to the franchise late than maybe any other franchise, and the way it ended breaks my heart. But that original title, that Final Fantasy, or that Metal Gear Solid 1, the voice acting, the depth of plot is something that was reserved only for JRPGs at that time, but it was different. It wasn't a fantasy. It was, someone famously said to me, if you had to quickly and succinctly describe Metal Gear Solid, it is Die Hard with anime characters. Some people don't like that description, but I think it's very apt because it is clearly inspired by 80s movies, Snake Plissken, like Escape from New York, and like kind of the infiltration element from like Die Hard, and like that gung-ho attitude. That's clearly the inspiration to 80s movies, so I just use Die Hard as a catch-all. But and some people really don't like the anime comparison, but remember that you fight a giant robot piloted by a clone with the assistance of a cyborg ninja with a laser arm. You don't get much more anime than that, than cyborg ninja with laser arm versus robot piloted by clone. So that's how I describe it. I loved it. Every element of Metal Gear Solid. It made stars out of its director, Hideo Kojima, on a level that I would say is comparable to Miyamoto, but with far less titles to his name. I mean, people have seen that E3 presentation where 2016, where Kojima was introduced by Sony, and the applause that he got, the fact that people know that name. He's one of the few directors, along with Miyamoto and maybe Aonuma, that people know, and it was really from that game. the amount, the depth, the stealth gameplay. Like, there is some amazing gameplay. The characters, the voice acting, the music, so memorable. A story that couldn't be told on prior generations, and yes, has less gameplay advancements as maybe some other games, even though there are some, but just gaming as a storytelling medium was moved forward by Metal Gear Solid. JRPGs did it with the scope, but Metal Gear Solid kind of did it with the flash, with the scale, the surface value style, and that was important. That's something, games are so cinematic these days. Games that are considered classics like Last of Us, Uncharted, God of War, even that cinematic flair kind of owes itself to a lot of earlier PlayStation 1 games, including Metal Gear Solid, because you just didn't get stories like that back then. So let's do the comparison, right? I can't tell you, this is hotly debated, because I will tell you right now, the defenders of these games are fiery. I might lose subscribers on this. I hope that I don't lose subscribers on this. These are both classics. I love them to death, and I can't tell you which ones hold up better or worse, because that's totally subjective. Me personally, while I can play Mario 64 all the time, and Ocarina, while not my favorite, Zelda is a great game, I'm leaning a little bit more towards FF7 and Metal Gear Solid, because I feel the dominance of JRPGs, and really RPGs in general in the West, was just kind of pushed forward by Final Fantasy VII. It made people explore. I mean, you have tons of JRPGs almost winning awards, Game of the Year, things like, they were pushed forward in the West by Final Fantasy VII, like the Tales series, even Dragon Quest, which is more popular in Japan, was made more famous by Final Fantasy VII's success here. It kind of opened up that door for the West. And I would say the gameplay is not as influential or as important as what Mario 64 did for 3D games. I'd say the impact, it's hard, but I just kind of prefer, if I needed to play something and say what really pulls on the heartstrings more, it's going to be FF7. And remember, neither of these were games that I owned as a kid. I played both of these as a kid, and I revisit annually. So I'm trying not to look through rose-tinted glasses. And on the more cinematic game, Ocarina of Time versus Metal Gear Solid, I have to go through Metal Gear Solid, because Metal Gear Solid is one of the few games where you can, like, David Hayter, the voice of Snake, like, there's no voices in Metal Gear Solid or in Ocarina of Time, but you don't know too many people that worked behind that game, often being brought up. Of course, Aonuma and Miyamoto, producers, director, but like Metal Gear Solid alone made that team, that voice cast, and that director a star, like right off the bat. And both series are beloved. Of course, Zelda is right now booming because of Breath of the Wild, and it's going to be ongoing. And Metal Gear Solid is probably firmly done. I'm on these two big titles, I'm leaning towards the PS1. But what do you think? These are the two. What are your favorites? There's no definitive answer. I'm just giving you my opinion on these. But we must move on. I spent the most time on those, but the next we're going to have to go through a little bit quickly, or this will be a 10-hour video. I'd say those are the S-class games, like the most important and popular on those consoles. But, of course, you have, following Ocarina of Time, you have Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, a fantastic title, not firmly as beloved, like quantity-wise, as Ocarina of Time, but still a lovely game. Weird, wild that Majora's Mask is an icon of a game, but you must compare that against Final Fantasy 8 and 9. Now, Final Fantasy 8, not my favorite Final Fantasies, not a lot of people's favorites, but still, pushing forward a story medium, great music, some people love it. But Final Fantasy 9, I think any Final Fantasy fan or JRPG fan who's played that game has loved it. So I would compare Ocarina of Time against FF9, and I'm going to go with FF9 there. But what are your thoughts on that? Those are but in sheer quantity, you have two Final Fantasies up against like one, sheer amount of like long form adventure games. Like, you got to give it to Final Fantasy on that. So what's another huge title on the N64 that most people associate it with it? And that's Mario Kart 64. Now, you can't deny that is probably the best or most well-known four-person kart racer on the N64. Everyone likes Mario 64. Has it aged well? That's up to you. There really wasn't anything quite like that on the PS1 until Crash Team Racing. Now, Crash Team Racing is great. Is it better than Mario Kart 64? I'm not sure. However, the N64 continued to have fantastic kart racing games like Diddy Kong Racing, which many people like more than Mario Kart 64. And you just had more options right there. So I'd have to say that when it came to the kart racers, you got to give it to N64. I love those games. But let's just go down. We have what are some of the how can I put it, more mature games on the N64, 2D outings. Let's say let's go with Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which I love to death. One of the greatest games that I missed as a kid, came back to as an adult, was wondering what the hype was, found what the hype was, and I'm like, yeah, this holds up. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is another game often considered by some to be the greatest game or one of the greatest games of all time. I have to firmly agree with that. And there was no real comparable game like that on the N64 that did well. There was no Metroid on the N64. That's a real shame. But when it came to like one of the best 2D games, I'd have to go with a lesser known game on the N64 made by Treasure. That would be Mischief Makers. Not the same type of game, but it was really like kind of a digging hard to get a true 2D game on the N64. Love Mischief Makers. That is one of my favorite N64 games. I think it is so overlooked. I hope that's brought to the service, the Nintendo Switch service, but I just don't think so. If you are an N64 fan and you have not played Mischief Makers, you're losing out. But if I had to compare them, I'm going with Symphony of the Night. Now, of course, the N64 had a ton of platformers other than Mario 64. Some people prefer Banjo-Kazooie, a lovely title that is now owned by Microsoft as an IP, but kind of is lent to Nintendo often over Mario 64. Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, fantastic games. What was PlayStation's kind of answer to this? Well, there was Spyro the Dragon, the trilogy, along with the sequels to Crash Bandicoot 2 and 3. You don't usually think about platformers when you think the PS1, but it did have them. It did have Crash and Spyro, which were kind of like de facto mascots for PlayStation as well, even though they were not owned by Sony fully, and they've moved on to other consoles since then, as have many Sony games. But, there were some answers. But when it comes to platformers, you have Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64. I'm looking down the list here. Conker's Bad Fur Day, my favorite Rare game. I like Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, but it's aesthetic, it's kind of stylings were never my favorite. I prefer Mario 64 over that, but my favorite platformer may actually be Conker. Maybe I'm an edgelord, but I loved Conker's Bad Fur Day, a very R-rated platformer. I loved its re-release even, the Live and Reloaded. Some people are iffy on that one, but I love both. You had the this is a 2.5D platformer, Kirby and the Crystal Shards. Very overlooked game on the N64. A lot of fun. Yoshi's Story, not bad. Kind of 2D platformer, 2.5D platformer on the N64. Nothing compared on Yoshi's Island on the SNES, but Yoshi's Story, pretty solid. So it's really up to you, but in terms of like true platformers, kind of age that are aimed at any age, I have to give it to N64, like Mario 64, and Donkey Kong, Banjo-Kazooie over the Crashes and Spyros. But the Crash and Spyro, particularly Spyro, were close, and they had more voice acting. Obviously, they were a little bit of a different flavor. Of course, but I'm just going to edge out and give that to the N64 just because I love Mario 64 and Conker so much. But a genre that was not very popular on the PS1 was first-person shooters. This was the console that you went to for the. This was the genre you went to the N64 for. Of course, there's GoldenEye, one of the most famous first-person shooters of all time. It's basically a slideshow when you go back and play it. It's a little rough going back, but it's still playable. There's Perfect Dark, which I think is an improved game that ran on the same engine. You have my favorite games on the console, other first-person shooters at the very least. The Turok franchise, particularly Turok 2, but Turok 1 was great. There was Rage Wars, which was a more multiplayer-focused Turok, and then Turok 3, Shadow of Oblivion. Not as good, but still a great game. There was Doom 64, an overrated gem that is now available on every console, strangely. It's like you can buy Doom 64 on the PS4. I don't know. And there were Doom and Quake on PS1. There was I think Final Doom on PS1. But when it came to like sheer quantity of first-person shooters and kind of the quality, I think you're going to have to go with the N64. I don't think there's going to be too much pushback on that. There were some good ones on the PS1, but the N64, for whatever reason, they just made more and ones that are a bit more famous. And it's hard for me to debate the N64. Kind of takes that. But we're going to talk about a genre that is a little harder to debate, a little bit more, more geared towards PlayStation, and that is survival horror. You're going to give this to PlayStation, let me tell you. Now, I try to, on these list of games, go for games that are exclusive to both consoles, so I won't be talking about games that appear on both as much. But PlayStation 1 has Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3. Kind of the forebears, the beginning of the boon of the survival horror genre, but I will take Resident Evil 2 off the table there because Resident Evil 2 is actually released on both platforms. They're different versions. Some people like the N64 version, some people like the PS1 version. I will say that the N64 port is amazing. Everyone knows that. It has FMV cutscenes and voice acting, which was very difficult on the N64. But we're going to take that one off the table, and we're just going to talk about Resident Evil 1 and 3 and this gem right here, Silent Hill. What can you say? The PlayStation takes this, no hands down. Both of these franchises are still beloved. Resident Evil is just as popular as it ever was. And while Silent Hill is now dead as a doornail, I don't think it's ever coming back. It is still pined for and loved by so many fans the world over. I mean, PT, which was a demo for a new Silent Hills game, was like the most beloved horror game of the last decade. And that's just a demo of the franchise. And people were so excited for that. So that shows you the pull that that franchise has. So survival horror, if you were into the scary stuff, you got to go with PlayStation. And that's not to discourage Parasite Eve, which is more of a RPG, but with a lot of horror trappings. Parasite 1 and 2 on the PS1. Something that is very uniquely PlayStation of the era. Very Japanese. Love it. If you haven't played Parasite Eve, most people know about it. It's a horror, survival horror JRPG set in New York City. And the second one, even though not quite as good in a lot of people's eyes, still pretty solid, more of an action-heavy game. You have to go with PlayStation. I mean, the sheer number of horror titles, there was others, Clock Tower. On the PS1, that's the console to go for. Sorry, N64, that's just something you can't compete with. But what you can compete with are those multiplayer games, those 4-player games. You know, you got to give that to N64. You have the Mario Party series. I believe it's Mario Party 1, 2, and 3. On there, you had 4-player games. Of course, legendary Super Smash Brothers, which is both a party and fighting game. I'm not one of those people that think it needs to fall into either category definitively. You can play it like a fighting game and a party game, and both are legitimate. I'm not going to argue that. Tell me how wrong I am in the comments, but I think it's a game that, depending on the rules that you set, can be in its own category. Platform fighter, whatever you want to call it. It's a great game, great series regardless, and it began on the N64 and it introduced a lot of people to characters that were kind of falling out of favor. Like for myself, not many kids my age knew who Ness was when you're 10 years old, you know. Even Samus, because Metroid had kind of fallen out of favor with Nintendo, which was my main. Like, I didn't know who Samus was before I played that game because, you know, it had been 8 years since that franchise produced a game. None of my friends had it. Regardless, party games, you know, you had the Mario Parties, you had Super Smash, you had the 4-player GoldenEye, the Perfect Dark, you had fun games like Rampage World Tour, which I believe had more presence on the N64. You know, that was a great 3-player game. You had, looking down the list, so many fantastic titles. Wave Race, Mario Kart 64, multiplayer, like couch co-op, you got to give it to the N64 on this. There's no way. If you have more than one friend over, if you have 2 or 3 friends over, this was the console to have, and you were going to have a blast. I still love Mario Party to this day. Some people don't, but that re-release on the Switch is fantastic, and that was one of the N64's strongest suits. However, when it comes to the basis of the pure multiplayer, one genre, when speaking of multiplayer, you got to give it to PS1. On the topic of, similar to what we said about Smash Brothers, fighting games. You have to give this to PlayStation. As great as Super Smash Brothers is, there's not too many other titles that fell into this genre on the N64 that are worth playing. Now, Mortal Kombat Trilogy and Mortal Kombat 4, 2 different versions, especially Trilogy, with the better version being on PS1. You know, but I'll kind of take that out of the equation. The sheer number of fighting games on this, I think this is a huge reason why Japan really ate up, along with JRPGs, the PS1, as well as perhaps an older audience. I mean, you have Tekken 1, 2, and 3. Tekken 3, 8.5 million units. Some people on my fighting game videos still say it's their favorite fighting game of all time. And Tekken Tag Tournament, like, you can't deny that. You had not the best versions, but you had versions of Street Fighter Alpha 3, Marvel vs. Capcom. I'm looking at a list here. X-Men Children of the Atom, Marvel Superheroes, Marvel X-Men versus Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. You had so many fantastic fighting games. Like, if I was to continue to list them, I think I could for quite a while. But when it came to that, Darkstalkers 3, Capcom versus SNK Pro. Capcom was going Rival Schools, Star Gladiator. These are, especially Rival Schools, like franchises people want to come back. People still love them, and there were so many available on the PS1. And if you want to count it, you can count Puzzle Fighter 2 and Pocket Fighter on the PS1, even though Puzzle Fighter 2 is more of a Tetris Attack type game. But so many fantastic fighting games on the PS1. That was the console to play if you wanted to get some fisticuffs in. I love Smash Brothers. It's a legendary title, but due to the sheer quantity of fantastic games, fighting games, mostly provided by Capcom back then, you have to go with PS1 on this. There's just no way. I mean, you know, even the bad ones still have some love. Like, people like Street Fighter EX and EX2. I like those games. They're not great at the time, but going back, they're fun. You know, it's really hard to debate. And then there's like, genres that were almost entirely absent on the N64, like the JRPG. There's Quest 64 on the N64. Okay, that's it. But like I mentioned earlier, PS1, a huge reason this console sold so well internationally. Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, Xenogears, Chrono Cross, Parasite even 1 and 2, like I mentioned earlier. Let's go to Vagrant Story. The Final Fantasy 1 through 6, except for 3, were all released on PS1 in the Final Fantasy Anthology, Final Fantasy Origins, and Final Fantasy Chronicles. You could also play Chrono Trigger on there. Just an amazing amount of classic, fantastic games, all falling under the JRPG genre. You had Grandia. You had, looking down the list here, Suikoden 2, how dare I forget? Legend of Mana, Alundra. Oh, unbelievable how many fantastic JRPGs are on the console. And really back then, JRPG it would just be an RPG. Oh, almost all non-PC RPGs on consoles were Japanese back then. You just got to give it. And then, there are games that don't necessarily fall under any categories, but they're great games worth mentioning. Like, what is Pokemon Snap? Pokemon Snap was a huge hit on the N64, along with Pokemon Stadium. Like, the presence of Pokemon on the N64 gives that an edge. Like, those are just weird, fun games. You had, before I move on, there is one fantastic RPG on the N64 that must be mentioned, and that is Paper Mario. It was a different type of RPG, but must say, fantastic RPG, but I still got to give it to the PS1 on that. There was, your extreme sports games on the both consoles. You had 1080 snowboarding on N64, fantastic game. But I still think PlayStation has that in sheer quantity. That's going to be, your Jet Motos, your how can I guess I could put this under the extreme sports. You had like the Twisted Metal 1, 2, 3, and 4 on there. You that's a tougher one to say because do you put racing in there like as in it's more of a sport game like the Gran Turismo games on PS1? Those kind of fall under a weird genre, but just something to mention nonetheless. And then let's see, then there's just like it comes down to the fact that I think that the N64 had a more concentrated focus on a lesser number of games, while the PS1, as you've seen, they were kind of all over the place. Every person who has an N64 probably shares a good chunk of their library with another person. Like, I think everyone who has an N64 has like Mario Kart, Super Smash Brothers, and a few others. But while I think the PS1 library, like you had your PS1 library, people who loved fighting games, you had people who loved RPGs, you had people that liked platformers, and maybe there's not a lot of overlap. So while I think that there's a vocal, like the N64, it seems like it's a more vocal love and defense of those games. I feel it's just because everyone had those games, and that's not to deter them. And that comes down to something I just found crazy a statistic is the amount of games released. The worldwide releases of games for the N64, the number of titles released was 393. 296 in the US, but 393, it's a good amount. Sounds like a lot. PlayStation 1, to the best of my records, released 7,918 games worldwide, 1,335 in the US. That's insane. The number of titles on the PS1 blew away anything on the N64. And that's not to say that quantity trumps quality, but it just shows you that there was a lot more variety perhaps on the PS1. And not only would there be like one title, like you have JRPGs on the N64, but it's like two. It's like Paper Mario, if you want to call it that, and Quest 64, while there's like 50 on the PS1. But even if you just look at the US, 1,335 to 296, you're going to have a bit more variety there. And it was odd. I feel a lot of the third-party support, everyone knows, kind of dropped off the N64. So you had Mega Man 64, known as Mega Man Legends, on the PS1 on both consoles. Great game. But the sequels, Misadventures of Tron, very sought-after game, and Mega Man Legends 2 only came out on the PS1. So you got to give it there. Along with a number of Mega Man titles, like Mega Man, I believe it was like 4, 5, and 6, only on the PS1. I think this really kind of hurt the N64, the lack of third-party support. Of course, Square Enix going over there, making so many fantastic games. And then you had a more mature theme on a lot of these games. You had the Tomb Raider franchise famously being mostly PlayStation exclusive. Some games were on the first game was actually a Saturn title for like a month before it came out on PS1, but you had Tomb Raider 1, 2, 3, and Last Revelation on PS1. You had games that blended between survival horror and action, more horror, but you get like Dino Crisis 1 and 2 only on PlayStation. Capcom just going hard on that. Square, Konami, and Capcom, particularly three of the biggest Japanese developers, third party. While they had some offerings on the N64, they were kind of very focused on the PS1, like Konami, famously Metal Gear Solid and Silent Hill. Capcom, everything except for like Mega Man Legends, everything Capcom went to PS1. Square Enix, literally everything. There are no Square Enix games on the N64. So if those were Namco, way more on the PS1. I don't know, but I can't think of many games. Maybe there were some Pac-Man games on the N64, but obviously the Tekken franchise and Soul Blade premiering on the PS1. And then there are the matter of licensed games, which I got to give to the N64, though, to give the N64 some love. The Star Wars games like Rogue Squadron, fantastic on the N64. I will not debate that. I will give the wrestling games for my old WWF, WCW homies. I think the N64 takes out with WrestleMania 2000 and especially No Mercy. Shadows of the Empire, another licensed game, fantastic on the N64. At least I liked it. And then you didn't have as many weird cuts on the N64 because there wasn't the sheer amount of titles. Like Sin and Punishment, recently released on the Switch, thankfully. It was on the Wii Shop, but never released in the US. Deep Cut, though, fantastic game. Sin and Punishment. You got to give that to N64. That's a great game. But the amount of like weird, wacky games on the PS1 that you could just find that not many people talked about, there were fantastic. Like Strider 2, fantastic game that, not many people may have heard of, but fantastic nonetheless. Soul Reaver premiering on the PS1. Bushido Blade 2. Medieval 2, Siphon Filter, Klonoa, fantastic platformer. Like maybe not the most popular games in sheer numbers, but things people love. The Bloody Roar games. You got to give the deep cuts, the hard to find titles, the ones that aren't Star Fox 64. If you wanted to dive in the library, I feel that pool is definitely deeper with quality on the PS1. But that's not to say that the N64, that more of a percentage wise of their games were quality though. Like out of the, let's say, I'd say no game, most games are bad. You know what I'm saying? Like it's more like, I think for every one good game made, there's probably three bad. I'd say the higher percentage of N64 games were definitely good. Nintendo controlled their quality. PS1, there's probably more quality games, more good games percentage wise is much lower. Odd metric to measure, but that's just how these numbers kind of pan out. Here's an example. This is my list. I'll show you guys right to the camera of really good N64 games. Looks like there's about 40 there. But on the PS1 side, it goes down to the bottom of the page and to the other side. And these are larger titles that, I think had a lot of weight. I see the difference is that N64 made one amazing title per franchise, like one really good Mario title, Mario 64, like platformer. But what PlayStation kind of did, probably because of the ease of programming the discs and whatnot, they would have a whole franchise. Like, yes, you have Mario 64, but you have 3 Crash games in comparison. You have Donkey Kong 64, but you have 3 Spyro games to kind of go up against. You have Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask is big adventures, but you have a ton of Final Fantasy games from like 7, 8, 9 Tactics, different genre, but still like a big adventure type of game. So it was kind of like a sheer numbers game that's, hard to kind of debate. Like numbers wise, sheer number of good titles, you got to give it to the PlayStation 1 numerically. Of course, this is subjective to an extent too, because some of you guys might be thinking, oh, these games are terrible, blah, blah. I know there's people that hate Metal Gear. I know people who hate Ocarina of Time, believe it or not. They think it's too overrated and GoldenEye. I know people that hate Final Fantasy, but you have to generally accept that these are beloved titles. And we're just spitballing here. This is a discussion. So yeah, I got to say this. What I found in my research was that people generally holds there's more of a vocal majority on certain N64 games being like some of the best of all time, because more people had them for that console base, while very few people in percentage wise may have had all these great PlayStation games. Take that info with a grain of salt, and you do with it what you will, but that is the truth. Another fun metric I learned, there were 7 games that sold over 7 million on the N64. I'm sorry, 7 games that sold over 5 million on the N64 in comparison to the 17 titles that sold over 5 million on the PS1. Yet again, this has to do with the install base, but that just shows you that some of these games are very quality. So yes, yet again, 7 games sold over 5 million copies on N64 compared to 17 on the PS1. And 2 games sold over 10 million on the PS1, that being Gran Turismo and Final Fantasy 7, and only one sold over 10 million on the N64. That's Mario 64. And of course, that's on base hardware. We all know that Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time and all these games have been bought many times on newer consoles. But, the numbers game, the sheer quantity of titles, you got to give it to PS1. Quality, that's up to you. But quantity, you got to give it to the PS1. And that's going to be a hard pill to swallow because, like I said, in the US, people are very defensive of both of these consoles, but particularly the N64. I mean, as someone who gets into heated arguments with games, I never get into arguments with people over the N64 in terms of quality because, man, you say Ocarina isn't the best game of all time to some people, they'll chop your head off. And you should never get to that point. This is for fun, But what's my take, Let's that's the numbers game, and thank you for listening me rant about that. I want comments about all of that, and I want the games that I missed. I'm not going to list them all. I thought I would, but it would take too long that I have here. But this is my take on it. This is my personal history with these and what I think of it as a collector and as a gamer and as someone who grew up around these consoles. Sega Saturn, I was in the middle ground. Not a ton of titles on it. A lot of games that I love. Nights into Dreams, one of my favorite games. Panzer Dragoon, and a ton of weird Japanese games like the Shining series and Bug 1 and 2. But I knew that these other two consoles just had more to offer. One of my best friends had the N64. We'd go over, we'd play those multiplayer games. We'd try to find stars in Mario 64. Fantastic. My other friend had the PS1. He had the Rayman and Spyro Crash games. Fantastic. I wasn't quite at the age where I could appreciate Metal Gear Solid and FF7. So back then, I would say as a youngin', and these games haven't gotten worse with time, I still love them, I would have told you the N64. But when I got a little older, could get some money, started collecting, and I went back and I started playing those PS1 games, Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy 7. That changed my perspective on gaming. I was, maybe 15 when I first played Final Fantasy 7, 2004. I played it well after it came out for the first time. I was avoiding RPGs. They're too long, they're too weird. I'm not turn-based. I don't want to do this. I played Final Fantasy 7 when the PS2 was out. 2004, I believe, was the first time I played it. So it was well past its visual prime. That game gripped me in a way that you couldn't believe. Final Fantasy 7 turned me on to JRPGs when its graphics were already, polygonal. I was obsessed. I needed to see Advent Children. I played every game in the franchise after that. And I think that storytelling, really gripped me. And then as I got older, not too far after that, actually, probably within the same year, I played Metal Gear Solid, and that became my favorite gaming franchise of all time. I'm a child of the late 80s. I love action movies. I love anime, and Metal Gear Solid had that wrapped up in a story that was unlike anything else. And that led me down that rabbit hole of trying games like that, more mature games. So though it's hard for me to say, I have many fond memories. I have more fond memories of the people I was around when I was playing N64. I have fun playing, great memories playing Mario Kart 64 and GoldenEye and Turok late into the night, and just being entertained for hours. That was the party game system. But when I was alone, as I got older, I would play the games on PS1, the JRPGs, late into the night by myself, because I just needed to know what happened next. I was so drawn into those large JRPG worlds. And, I'll say even now when I bring friends over and we play some retro games, most likely the, multiplayer games we're going to play are N64 games, unless we're doing fighting games, unless we want to play Tekken 3, unless we want to play Rival Schools. Probably my favorite 2.5D fighter on the PS1. So, yeah, I got to say, N64, I probably won't play by myself that much. I've gone through Mario 64 a few times, but the Zelda titles, I love Zelda, but it's never been my favorite franchise. Don't cut my head off for that. But I find myself going back to those games less and less. Well, PS1 games, I keep finding titles that I love. I recently this year got into Klonoa, the first one on PS1, downloadable on the PS3, and I'm like, this is incredible. During the pandemic, I went through the 3 Mega Man Legends games, 1, 2, and Tronmon. Loved them. I see why people loved them so much. And Mega Man Legends 1 actually came out before Ocarina, and you can see that it's a similar type of game, but it did it before Ocarina in a lot of ways. I love Pokemon. I love Pokemon Snap and Stadium. I can go back and play Pokemon Stadium, but Pokemon Snap 1 and 2, you really can't play the way they are meant to be played today without having a ready file on your Game Boy, so those are kind of out the window. And both these consoles are so special, but yet again, I think that collectors who play their games, there are collectors who don't play their games. Let me tell you, I try to play every one of the games I buy, and if I love it, I beat it. have a pulled back perspective where we see kind of what a console was trying to do and see its library as a whole. And both of these are fantastic. I can't definitively say which one is better, but as someone who came to these consoles later, who owned them later than they were expected, I myself find myself playing PS1 games more. I just, Strider 2, I remember that was a big one for me. But then again, don't get me wrong. I'll find the occasional title on N64. I'll find the Mischief Makers. I'll find the Doom 64. I'll find the Sin and Punishment. Fantastic game. Don't skip that. Those I love, but there just seems to be less of those deep cuts that I love as an adult than the N64. And, it's funny enough, both of my favorite games on these consoles, Turok 2, which I'll die on that hill. I love that game so much. It's been released on everything. Final Fantasy VII has been released on everything. But I have to look at them in the realm of them being exclusives for this comparison video. I got to give it to the PS1, but I'm not going to disrespect anyone who likes the N64 more. That game just had so many killers. Like I said, every Mario title, every Zelda title, all the first-person shooters. But I keep finding good PS1 games, and that's where I'm going to lean. I'm going to lean on the PS1 side of this argument. I think numerically, there are so many good single games on the N64. There are so many good series, entire series. Like I said, Tomb Raider, Twisted Metal, Final Fantasy, Resident Evil, Spyro, Crash, Mega Man. There's just so many amazing games that I keep finding. The fighting games, Dino Crisis, Parasite Eve. I can go on, and even when they're of the same series, like Castlevania. I like Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness. I think they're more fun than people give them credit for. It's no Symphony of the Night. Symphony of the Night, people often forget. That game was overlooked in its time. It's one of the best games of all time. So I'm going to have to lean towards the PS1 on this. But I want your thoughts on this because this was so much fun to go through. I found out so much information, especially people outside the US. What are your thoughts on the N64? Like I said, I was astonished, especially in Europe. 4.5 million out of the many countries in Europe. Did you guys ever even see one? And for N64 lovers, did you ever wonder what was happening on the PS1 side of things? Did you want to play, Legend of Dragoon or Final Fantasy or Vagrant Story? What are your thoughts about this? What platformers did you like? Do the platformers on PS1, did you like them more than N64? Were Crash and Spyro enough to stack up against Donkey Kong and Super Mario 64? What games do you think are underrated? What games do you think are overrated? But the most important thing I want out of this is just kindness. I have seen greatness in my audience. I've seen very friendly comments about, my videos and other opinions. I'm willing to hear it. I'm not going to argue with you. I think gaming is a great, entertainment source. I think it's a great way to meet new people and talk and talk about your opinions without getting nasty. We're all here to find new games. I like to think a large part of my audience is collectors and game enthusiasts. What's better than finding a new game that you didn't know about on a console you didn't have much information about? All games can be fun. I think Stop Skeletons from Fighting, a great gaming YouTuber, summed this up perfectly for me. There's no good or bad games. In my opinion, there's just interesting games and not interesting games, because the worst game you can think of, trust me, somebody loves it. So it's really what interests you and what doesn't. And that's what I want to hear about. What are your thoughts on this console war between these legendary consoles, the beloved N64 and the legendary PS1? And thank you so much for listening to me rant and ramble about numbers and games from over 25 years ago. Hey, we're getting old, guys. And if you youngins out there have discovered these consoles recently and love them, tell me why. What are some of the games that you've gone back to and played it and loved and seen why people have loved so much? Even if you're older, what are some of these games you've gone back to and loved? I mean, I didn't play Symphony of the Night till 2007. I thought that game was fucking flawless. So thank you for listening to me again. My name is Mike. Please give me suggestions for other discussion topics like this if you like hearing stuff like this, because I love making stuff like this. Please subscribe if you haven't, and have a fantastic night. Take care.